Um, let's see. I'm the speaker today, so let's say a couple things before we start. I mean, one is I thought I'd sort of make an announcement that I'm feeling better. Like I had that surgery and I'm getting stronger. I mean, I don't know if I'll ever be able to walk like a normal person, but I was able to, I could drive the car and I was able to go to the grocery store and like, I'm up and around, which for about a year before that, I couldn't go anywhere. So really a relief. There's that. And then also, no warranties on this talk today. I don't know how I feel about it, but I'm making an effort. I'll stop talking in a half an hour and we'll see where things land. I feel funny about it, but I'll give it a try. I mean, the thing I wanted to talk about today was about Buddhist practice, and then about cultivating integrity, and just like sort of my experience of that, which it's definitely been hard work for me. I'll say, I've tried like in recovery to develop integrity in my life, but I have to say it hasn't come very naturally to me. Like I feel like a working stiff, like in the world of integrity actions. But I've certainly kept trying. So everybody here knows that I'm in recovery from drugs and alcohol. I've been sober for 38 years. I have a birthday in May. I'm coming up on another one. So I want to talk about my practice, but in order to explain myself and my current practice, my Buddhist practice, I have to talk a little bit about my history. So I grew up in a family that was, saturated with drugs and alcohol. I mean, in the 1960s. And in my early life, there was just drugs everywhere. I mean, there was prescription drugs and psychedelic drugs and cannabis and alcohol. And I started using drugs and drinking almost every day when I was about 14. And I would classify myself as a teenage drug addict. My mother was an alcoholic. I mean, she was also, charming and intelligent and artistic, and she's really good at clothes, like clothes horse. She's a very refined person, like perfect English, but, she was also a drug addict. She did get clean and sober before she died. She died with like 28 years clean and sober, but she didn't get clean until I was in my 50s. So, I mean, I was long gone. So I want to be careful not to paint my parents as bad people. I did love them, but they were certainly eccentric and they were really difficult people. My father was a neurosurgeon from Duke. He was the chief of surgery for like 100 years. He also had a severe like eating disorder. He was anorexic, and he was one of these ultra marathon runners that weighs like 99 pounds, and he was down in the operating room working on people's brains all day. Odd, I mean, I'd put him on the spectrum, I'd say it that way. And I mean, they're good people, interesting people, but really not cut out for the role of parenting. And my parents got divorced when I was about 3. Now, I would say that my parents carried their own sort of multi-generational trauma. The Great Depression, World War II. My father had been in the Marine Corps. I mean, that's what's known as the silent generation. And then all of the rules of the alcoholic family were firmly in place in my family. Don't talk, don't trust, don't feel. I mean, those are the 3 big rules of alcoholic families. And one thing I learned in my early life was that you should avoid feeling things at all costs. Like, that's an unspoken rule in alcoholic families. And I was a good student, and I made sure I didn't have an authentic feeling until I got sober. And I come to San Francisco, the first time I came was in 1969, and then I came for good in 1975. But in those years, like the party was on in San Francisco in the 1970s. I mean, any gay event was centered in drugs and alcohol. I mean, all there was bars. I mean, there was no gay Buddhist groups, there's no gay running clubs. It's just like the Wild West, and it was very dangerous. I mean, this is before AIDS, like a decade before HIV. Lots of risky behavior, lots of marginalized people who didn't have much to lose. I got clean and sober in 1986, and when all those drugs wore off, I just felt absolutely horrible. I mean, the full weight of my incarnation and sort of my bad behavior was just on top of me. I was really filled with a lot of shame then. And like lots of addicts, I behaved irresponsibly. And I mean, and the worst part of my alcohol and drug use was that I hurt people that I actually loved, and I couldn't stop using. I'd done some crazy shit when I was a teenager. I had a very predictable bottom. Shame, humiliation, despair. I mean, that's the price of admission to Alcoholics Anonymous. But once I got in the program, the desire to stay sober really grew in me, especially when I saw other people in the program starting to get better. So I saw signs of life in people around me that were in recovery. That was very motivating for me. I can remember this really skinny junkie, like in Narcotics Anonymous, and then, he came in and then he put on like 5 pounds, and he started looking human again. And I remember, I thought, wow, that guy's getting better. And I can remember seeing another guy come in. He was like this very stone-faced kind of biker type. And then all of a sudden, a couple of months into the program, he starts having a sense of humor and like cracking jokes. Like little signs that they were getting well. And then that was very moving to me. And those little things made me feel like I could get better myself. So I got a sponsor, and he was very good to me. He died from HIV in 1990, but his attention made me feel so good. I really hadn't had that kind of attention before, like positive reinforcement from somebody that I really respected and respected me back. I mean, that wasn't a big part of my early life. The thing I craved most in early recovery was the sense of being at ease about myself. Like I was just really uncomfortable, and I found feeling at ease to be very hard to come by. I know now that feeling good about yourself comes from living a life that's in alignment with what you crave most deeply, which is actually integrity. Like nothing feels as good as that. And Buddhist practice and then 12-step recovery really offered me a way forward. But actually that's been very hard work for me. I asked my sponsor at the time how I can get better self-esteem. And his thing to me was, you should do esteemable things or actions. I took that to heart. That seemed like a reasonable prescription. And I've tried. I went to lots of school as an adult. I went to college for 12 years after I got into the program. And then I worked at Kaiser for 24 years as a nurse practitioner. And then I've been sitting for like 39 years. And none of those things was easy for me. And I made all those efforts on my own. Nobody helped me with that. So I was really devoted to school. I liked learning things. I even teach school now, which I find a deep pleasure. So I would say that my effort's been sincere. But I carried a lot of shame about my family and about my own bad behavior, which that's not unusual for people that come into recovery. I don't think anybody comes in feeling good about themselves. And in my family in particular, once it came to light that I was gay, the shit really hit the fan. Scapegoated in my family for being gay. And scapegoat is a stereotype, and I have to say I kind of climbed into that. Gay culture in the 1960s and the 1970s was so unhealthy. Bars, bathhouses, anonymous sex, lots of wounded people that hated themselves. And it was like the whole of gay culture at that time was trying to reinforce this kind of internalized belief that they were unworthy. And then for me, being kind of a hellraiser and like a gay druggie, that really affirmed that kind of identity for me that the gay culture had sort of conditioned me to accept. That was the trope around gay people. And literally everybody at that time, if you told them you were gay, they'd say something was wrong with you. You're a sinner, you're a criminal, you're a pedophile, you're mentally ill, you've got some terrible physical illness, there's something wrong with your brain, you've been cursed, whatever. But those messages, it's hard not to internalize those messages when that's what the entire world was telling you. So I followed my sponsor's suggestion. I tried to do things, but in order to do that, I had to figure out why I did all that crazy shit in the first place. But one obvious thing to me was that I was just young, and I was full of testosterone, and I really liked pushing the boundaries. I'd been out on my own a lot. No scaffolding at home. I loved leather bars. I loved narcotics. I liked hustlers, strippers, really people on the margins. I really romanticized marginalized groups. But when I sobered up, those people started looking less attractive, and I felt like shit, really bad. The thing about somebody who grows up in an alcoholic family and then they become an addict themselves is that there's often this kind of compounding of like guilt and shame. Like, not just from the way I behaved, but from what was done to me. So, and I felt responsible for my parents' dysfunction, even though I didn't have any control over it. I mean, that's not uncommon for kids in alcoholic families. One of my deepest motivations for getting clean and sober was I thought it would heal my family of origin. And then I can guarantee that didn't work out. I mean, they all went to their graves just being as difficult as ever. Like, nobody got better for me not using except for me. So in AA specifically, I got this idea in my head that I kind of needed to atone for my addiction. Like, almost like I needed to redeem myself from being, like, fundamentally flawed. So in AA, they speak of character defects. And, I find that term now, character defects, to be really misleading. I would name those behaviors as survival skills. In AA, when you do the fourth and fifth step, they ask you a lot like, what was your part in things? And that's not a bad question, but it's really hard to explain what your part in things was when you were barely an adolescent when all that trouble started. Like, every time in AA, when I bring up my family of origin, people would say, stinky thinking, or like, you're wallowing in self-pity and resentment. Just don't drink, go to meetings, and help others. And those are great suggestions. I owe my life to Alcoholics Anonymous, and it's a good start. But for me, it definitely wasn't the whole journey. Like, I needed to feel those bad feelings about my family in order to be free from them. And I started to understand that in Alcoholics Anonymous, that I was just trying to redeem myself. I mean, the problem with redemption is that it really reinforces this feeling that you were already broken to start with. And then lots of people that come from alcoholic families carry this sense that something's wrong with them from the start, that somehow they were defective or somehow a burden on the family. And then in AA, I started to feel like redemption was like, finally I was going to get good enough. Like, and the problem with that is that it really confirms this false belief that I had to be redeemed because there was something bad with me from the start. My feeling now is that there wasn't anything wrong with me. I wasn't ever a bad person, but the system was fucked up. But I did have this feeling like if I keep doing all the right things, maybe one day I'll feel as good inside as other people do. But so a lot of my life in Alcoholics Anonymous was about this kind of hustle, like to sense that I was just okay. And now I think what looked like moral failures earlier in my life was just a trauma response. So I don't know what it means to fall if really, like, the behaviors were just like you were adapting to some kind of chaos. And I have to say this, I felt a strange loyalty to my family, but also unable to say anything to them that would appear to be confrontational. Like, if you voiced a concern in my family, it would be seen as betrayal. I mean, and I was already 40 or 50 years old when I'm feeling these things. So I would compare it to having one foot on the gas pedal and the emergency brake on at the same time. So very difficult for me. Like, I felt committed to them, and then, they were just as nutty as ever, and you couldn't say anything about it. Silence is like the rule in those families. But coming to understand that my alcoholism didn't arise in a vacuum was very powerful for me. I had a lot of coping mechanisms, I had a lot of trauma. And then so I started doing ACA work. That's really been like my spiritual program for the last couple of years. That and Zen Buddhism. But, the difference between working the steps in AA and working the steps in ACA was very different. AA really focuses on, like, external behaviors like drinking and making amends for the harms you caused by drinking. And, those are good suggestions. I'm not criticizing AA at all. I need to clean up my relationship with the world in order to make room for recovery. But the focus was very much on the external world and focusing on others. Like, for example, helping newcomers, which isn't a bad suggestion. But when I got to ACA, it was like I it gave me permission to turn the focus more inside, like towards like emotional healing and internalized trauma and like the whole of my emotional life since I was born. So, you know, I feel like AA missed something for me anyway. It was the deeper work wasn't available. And it's not that the work was unnecessary, but it was just that it was a portion of what I needed to do. Like, so I needed both programs. I needed them to be sequential. You know, for me, it was kind of like getting on a bus and you realize, okay, this bus just goes to, 114th Street, but my goal is, 180th, so I'm going to have to change buses now. So a big part of my healing in the last few years has been about trauma and dysfunctional patterns that I learned in my alcoholic family and what I thought, I blame myself for bad choices, but I think now that a lot of the choices I made were just like survival mechanisms, like shaped by the environment. But also when I think of my original family, you think like, what are the factors that would protect against addiction? Like parental involvement or positive role models or, some kind of family bonding or, academic engagement or, healthy friendships or, growing up in my family is like living in a boarding house with people that were really unpredictable. Like I didn't feel connected to them. I didn't feel understood by my family. I didn't feel like I was very important to them. And so, those would have been protective factors that could have reduced the likelihood of me becoming a drug addict. But, those weren't in my early life, and that wasn't part of my story. And, my aspirational goals were like, I was really into strippers and drug dealers. And, there was no guidebook for how to be gay in the 1960s when I was a teenager. So, that was just really hard. I didn't know what to think. But so I guess what I want to say is, what does all that have to do with Buddhist practice? In my case, just like everything. I started sitting when I got sober, like Zen Buddhist practice, and then recovery for me, it's like scaffolding for like my personal growth. And when I first started meditating, I was really drawn to, there was a few people who had something I wanted, but I couldn't really name that, but it was a kind of dignity. And especially Isan Dorsey and Darlene Cohen, they were both very pivotal figures for me. I felt close to them. I spent lots of time with them, some with Renshin and me and Darlene together. Lots of concentrated exposure to both of them. Both of them, they're dead now. They were complicated people. I felt like I saw them at their worst and at their best, but both of those people had aspirational goals and some kind of dignity that was very magnetic to me. And I wanted something they had. I'm not sure if the practice brought that out in them or they were just born that way, but I have to say, I've seen people sitting in the Zendo before, and it looked like they expressed some kind of very deep part of themselves that you could only see in the Zendo. Like, I'd see them on the street, like in front of Zen Center, and they seemed so ordinary to me. And then I saw them sitting in the Zendo, and I thought, oh my God, I've completely missed the point. You're actually Avalokiteshvara. You're right here. I can't see it. That was very moving to me. But also it spoke to some part of myself that really craved integrity and like honesty and a life that was manageable. And I really believe that our Zen Buddhist practice helps you to cultivate integrity. And Zazen for me has become a kind of method for me to parent myself, like as they say in ACA, to become my own loving parent. And the practice has made me like more legible to myself, often because I was able to name my feelings, like you just being quiet like that. Like I didn't always like what I saw, but it gave me some language to explain myself to myself, and then a way to work on the parts of myself that needed some love and some attention. The thing about Zazen is that, by my lights, it doesn't really ask you to be good. But I think Zazen invites you to sit still enough to become like whole. Like whole is very different than good. Whole means all the parts of yourself get a place at the table. Meaning, like in my case, my unstable, kind of incarcerated, drug addicted teenager, and then also like the very best parts of myself and all the ways in which I'm just so very ordinary. But I mean, there is a part of me that has high aspirations. I mean, that's a lot of ground to cover, but Zazen is like a very big field. Like there's room for lots there. Also, I feel like the practice it's like about slow, steady pressure, like sort of a non-coercive presence, like very attentive, very loving, and then just applying that every day. And when you sit every day, that kind of attitude starts to permeate like into your day-to-day life. Feel like your relationships and your work, and it's very helpful. That kind of loving presence turns towards yourself on a daily basis. Also, I noticed that if you're trying to like dominate your mind or your body in Zazen, it just doesn't work that well. I've tried to treat my mind and my body with like attention that's firm but like very loving, like the way you would treat like a very restless child, like paying attention but trying to contain it in some way. I mean, there's that line from Suzuki about giving your sheep or cow a very spacious meadow, like is the way to control them. So, I mean, that practice really worked for me. I feel like our practice is very plain, like it's very humble. Zazen doesn't really let you perform, but it's like the practice really encourages this kind of wholeness that arises if you do it on a regular basis. And I feel like some kind of integrity's grown from me because I stopped running from parts of myself. Like Zazen, it gave me a way to reconnect the fragmented parts of myself. Like, and I, like most people, have competing parts. Like there's a part of me that wants to be good. There's a part that wants to be liked. There's a part that wants to be a winner. There's parts of me that wants to hide away. But like sitting in Zazen, you have to be very honest with yourself. I mean, there's nowhere to hide. And then you sit, with your own mind and its habits and its distractions and kind of restlessness. And like, it's very gentle, it's very persistent, but it's training in presence. Like, I've seen people that it doesn't lend itself to being like performative. Like I've seen people, especially young men before, and they sit and they almost sit like it's an athletic event, like I'm sitting like a Buddha. And, I tried that, but I just couldn't sustain it. Like, at some point, I was like, there's no audience, But I really got used to sitting with some kind of level of discomfort and trying to be less reactive to whatever comes up. And then, I guess, I just long for this kind of integrity in my life. And a lot of it meant, for me, trying to get clear enough to choose like what was deeply important to me over my first initial impulses towards something. Like, and that's a thing that comes from sitting. Like whenever there's a conflict or a crisis, like with me, my first reaction is like, fuck this shit, I'm not going to do this. But then actually from sitting, I got this like how to stay with something longer, like before I acted. Like, I guess maybe is a way to respond instead of react. So, and then there's a kind of integrity in that. I mean, integrity doesn't give you instant rewards in the world. In fact, in short term, it often feels worse. It's not flashy. It's never immediate, and it can actually feel like super painful. I spent the last 40 years trying to learn to tell the truth, which is not always easy. And I've noticed that often when I'm trying to tell the truth, it means risking something, like a job, like a sense of belonging, a relationship, like kind of threatening. It's something threatening my survival in some way. And especially if you grew up in a world where your survival depended on not telling the truth or denying what your feelings were. So, like, that felt very dangerous or unnatural to me, but I think it's gotten easier with time. one thing is, when I first got clean and sober, I got this job working in this very fancy French restaurant in Sausalito. And like when I was new in recovery. I was going to practice telling the truth. And so when I got the job, I told myself I'm going to tell everybody here that I'm gay and that I'm an alcoholic and I'm in recovery. And there wasn't any kind of support for that when I started working there. Lots of like snotty French waiters worked there, and they all drank kind of effete, and there's lots of alcohol, and it was a very high stress waiter job. But I thought, I'm going to tell the truth. I'm going to put my recovery first. And if I feel like I'm going to drink, I'm just going to walk out the door. Like, it's not worth it to me. And I did tell the truth, and nobody cared that I wasn't drinking. Nobody cared I was gay. I mean, newsflash, I wasn't even that important to them. But so, this thing of being gay, you have to come out like over and over and over again. Even this week at the swimming pool. Like, I go to the same pool in the morning at 7 a.m. and there's all these guys there, the 7 a.m. swimmers, and they're mostly retired straight guys. And so eventually, after some months, we start having a conversation, and inevitably somebody will ask me if I'm married. And then I'm thinking, do I have to tell them I'm gay? Like, how are they going to react to that? Like, am I over disclosing? And so now, finally, my thing is I just say, yes, I'm married. His name is David. And so, it was, I have to still navigate. I noticed I'm still feeling itchy about that. Like, I'm still navigating uncertainty around that. So, I guess what I want to say mostly is that I think our practice really encourages you to try to line up your inner life with your outer actions, and then when that happens and it's consistent, it's really magic. I mean, that's better than anything. And then that usually happens in very small actions, like telling the truth when it's really inconvenient, or just trying to be nonviolent, like meaning not gossip about people, or even though it feels so good, or judging people, which feels great, which I try not to do that. So I'm trying to embody what I believe in, but it usually turns out to be like really small, everyday choices that make up my life. And I think that the most spiritual thing I can do is try to work on myself, and I think Zazen's a really great way for me to do that. So I think I kind of said too much. I wasn't thrilled about this talk, but anyway, I'm going to stop there. Thank you.